A lot of news to cover. Our good friend, Dr. David Allen White, joined the Angels on Monday, and I'll celebrate his life at the end of this hour. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was confirmed as Health and Human Services Secretary. I'll get to that. But I want to begin with Admiral Mark Montgomery, retired United States Navy. Vice Admiral Montgomery returns. Not very long ago, he was here talking about defense modernization. But I asked him this morning if he would come and join me for half an hour because of a story I was sent this morning by a U.S. Marine Corps general, retired, about the launch of the new Fujian carrier by China and the fifth generation fighter it is deploying, the J-35. And I thought, oh my, what's this mean? And Admiral Montgomery showed up. Thank you, Admiral. Where are you today?
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for having me. I'm in Honolulu. I'm at the Honolulu Defense Forum, a security discussion hosted by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command with a lot of our allies and partners out here in the Pacific.
I'm glad to see you dressed appropriately. The first time I went over there as a lawyer, I was dressed in full howley, wearing a tie and a coat. Boy, did I stand out. So I'm glad you dressed appropriately. Admiral, first of all, your reaction to that story that I sent you. Maybe you already knew about the Fujian and the F-35, or their J-35 fifth generation fighter, but I didn't. What'd you think?
Well, I have to resist the snarky answer, which is, boy, just another target for U.S. attack submarines, and recognize that the real key to this story is the indication of just how much stronger Chinese shipbuilding is than American shipbuilding. And this is both in merchant marines, where you get these incredible numbers, like they build 230 times more merchant ships than
Wow.
we do each year. But also in naval shipbuilding, where the numbers are more like 7, 6, 7, 8 to 1 in terms of tonnage per year. But they're outperforming us there as well, which is why Senator Wicker has pretty wisely put a lot of his chips down on fixing the American shipbuilding problem.
Now, Admiral, before I come back to the carrier and submarines, one of the few people who've focused on that, I mean, you have, Captain Jerry Hendricks has, Mike Gallagher did, Tom Cotton does. One of the few people who is always talking about it is Elbridge Colby. He's been nominated to be the Undersecretary of Defense, and there are some anonymous, I don't even know if these senators are actually exist or if they're made up by the Hill, chirping at Elbridge Colby trying to sink that ship before it sails. What do you make of that resistance to Bridge Colby?
So first, we've had a relationship for 15 years where we've
Oh,
usually been friends. We've had some disagreements over support to Ukraine, where I think it's necessary as part of an overall deterrence efforts, and even sometimes about the specificity of our support for Taiwan. But I want to say this: Bridge Colby, he's a patriot. He's a smart guy. He is, of the people I've seen eligible for this, he is the right guy to go into this job. Look, I disagree with him on Ukraine, but that's not his decision. That's going to be the president's decision. I think and I disagree sometimes on how much to support Taiwan, but again, that's not going to be his decision. I think having someone who's been outward and vocal and speaks, what he believes to be the truth is the right kind of person to have in this kind of job. So, look, we don't agree on everything, but I didn't agree on everything with the Biden administration. That's for certain. I think it's inappropriate for him to be chipped away like this. If people want to criticize him, they should come right out front and say it, sir, not
yeah.
behind his
I,
back anonymously with the Hill.
That's what makes me crazy. And I really do want an eloquent, smart person who can articulate a position and argue it out with senators if he wants to argue it out. But a China first policy, China's the pacing threat. It's so obvious to me. And I don't know what the right solution is. Like you just said, I like supporting Ukraine fully so that we get Putin to the table. But attacking Bridge Colby is out of line. And if any Republican votes against him, I think they're going to get blowback, a lot of blowback. Now, Admiral, what I asked you in my email this morning is if they've got this new carrier and this new J-35, we need attack submarines. We need a lot of them. How many do we have? How critical is our shortage or readiness, and how do we fix that?
So we have, it changes week to week with commissionings and decommissionings. It doesn't happen that often, but it changes over months. We have around just over 50. We're on a decline right now where we're decommissioning 2 to 3 a year, and we're building 1.2 a year. So we're headed down towards 47, 48. And by the way, it could have been 42 or 43, but actions were taken during the last Trump administration to kind of arrest that. The reason I say that is if you ask what's the wargaming number of total submarines to generate the submarines you need for it, it's probably 69 or 70. So I told you we had 50, 52,
Whoa.
not 70. That's a significant shortfall that will be felt on day 1, day 7, day 28, day 42 of this conflict. So we're going to need to build more submarines. As you know, we're aiming for 3.0, we're paying for 2.0, and we're getting 1.2 submarines per year. These are attack submarines. And I don't see that number changing aggressively over the next 3 to 4 years. We can take aggressive up steps now, so it changes aggressively 4 or 5 years from now.
Now, Admiral, for the benefit of the Steelers fans, will you describe the state of our best attack submarine and what it can do vis-a-vis, for example, these carriers? And I keep in mind the wonderful book from the Cold War, Blind Man's Bluff. And we used to follow around the Russian subs and the Russian stuff, all the Soviet stuff, and they didn't even know we were there. We cut cables or tapped into cables. They didn't know we were there. What can the Virginia class do vis-a-vis the PLAN ships and submarines?
So I believe the Virginia class and the later Los Angeles class, that's our older ships, are significantly better than their Chinese counterparts and better than their Russian counterparts. And that's important. We have a significant asymmetric advantage in undersea warfare. And they're not just better than their submarines, they're able to avoid detection by their aircraft and ships. That all goes together. So submarines are part of any. When I wrote our war plans for 3 or 4 years in Indo-Pacific Command, they're a big part of it. I will say this: submarine warfare is inherently deliberate and slow warfare. Submarines do not move around like the Star Trek Enterprise at warp speed. They move around in a combat environment at much lower speeds. In what we've seen on terrain is 10 to 20 miles an hour. And with the vast ocean east of Taiwan, where their target set is, it's going to take them days or weeks or a month to get rid of all the targets. And so not having 70 and instead having 50, which gets you, obviously these both get you lower numbers on station, not having the right number means that these ships are going to go even slower in their job. And this is a time sensitive action that's going on. So it really does matter that we don't have enough of these submarines that are otherwise kind of butt kicking U.S. tools of power.
When we say we've got 50, some are in the yards, some have not been repaired. Is it classified? I don't have any idea. How many are forward deployed into that area of the world?
So what's classified as how many are forward deployed. We know that we forward station 5 submarines in Guam. That number can sometimes be 4, sometimes be 6. And it's 5 growing to 6 permanently. What that means is those families, and the ships operate exclusively out of Japan. They do their testing and maintenance and training, in Guam, testing, maintenance, and training in Guam. And the families actually live with their sailors in Guam. Now, the number that have come from San Diego or Hawaii and are forward deployed at any one time, that number is classified. But you can imagine it's a low number if things generally rotate in the Navy on a 6 months on, 18 months off kind of flow. You don't have that many forward.
So, in terms of the ability to find and sink capital ships of the People's Liberation Army Navy, do we have enough right now to deter China from doing anything short of full-out war, which would include hypersonic missiles and whatever else China wants to throw at us?
So, when I think about that kind of worst case scenario of a China executing a cross-strait invasion and us having to push back on it, the bad news is we don't have enough submarines. The good news is we fight as a joint force. And that joint force includes other elements of the Navy, Air Force, Army, and Marine Corps, Space Force. But the key elements to this are going to be Navy submarines, followed by Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps aviation, dropping anti-ship cruise missiles and anti-ship weapons on the Chinese, and then Army and Marine Corps launching ground-based weapons from either Japan, the Philippines, or maybe someday Taiwan itself. And this is all joined by Taiwan doing the same thing, ground, air, and naval. When we add that all together, Hugh, I still think we're at that point where we're not at 2027 yet. In fact, 2027 being the putative year where China might be able to conduct this and we may not be able to stop it. I actually think over the starting with the Trump 45 and some investments in Biden administration. We've actually moved that to the right. So it's now 2029, 2030. So the long answer, or the short answer, Hugh, is we can do it as long as we have things besides submarines, and we have things besides submarines.
Admiral, my wife's grandfather was fired by FDR because he testified to the Senate that Imperial Japan might strike the United States. And so Admiral Tausig was cashiered. Has anyone stepped up to say, basically, China might actually try a surprise attack on us?
So I haven't heard anyone say a surprise attack. I do know one of my deputies when I was at INDOPACOM eventually became an Air Force four-star named Mike Minahan, General Mike Minahan, who's head of Air Mobility Command. And kind of famously, 18 months ago, he said very publicly, we have to be ready for China in 2025. We need to be more aggressive, more warfighterly. He was speaking to his Air Mobility Command personnel. I think he was told, hey, knock it off. He then issued 6 months later a memo that said, hey, what I said before, I mean it. Get out there, be ready to fight. So it wasn't so much that he was going to Congress, but his internal transmission, which was leaked externally and got in the press, was we have to be more ready. We have to be more aggressive. I would say he was retired one job early, and wasn't the U.S. Transportation Command commander because of his frank talk about the Chinese threat.
No, there is a corollary then. All right, I got to go look that up. Second question. I heard a former CNO, and I'm not sure, I can't remember if it was off the record or on the record, so I'm not going to tell you which one, give a speech. Jerry Hendricks was there to give another speech. And the former CNO said at the beginning of World War II, our submarine captains were woefully unprepared for actual combat. And that he warned, do we have people who are warfighters in those boats? What do you think?
So I think things have changed. Do I think there's still risk that there will be some captains found wanting in combat? Yes. Do I think that risk is as high as 1941? No. Part of it is the quality and amount of training we bring to the warfighter now. When you go to a place like Top Gun out at Fallon in Nevada, the degree to which the F-18 pilots can first fight a game in a simulator, fight each other in a simulator, practice a long-range strike with an adversary around them in a simulator, and then go fly it out on a range with high-performance aircraft going against them. We've all seen the movies. We all know that. I'm telling you, the same thing now exists in the surface force for the surface ship commanders and in the submarines, and that's brought together in joint tactical training exercises that really emphasize the speed and challenge and the lack of information. You still got to make a decision. That's what paralyzed some of our COs in 1941. So there's that part. The second part was a lot of our stuff didn't work. Our torpedoes were awful at the beginning of World War II. And I think we're doing a better job operationally testing them. Now, the Red Sea, the Houthis have given us a free test of all those anti-ship cruise missile, all our systems are shooting down cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. We're doing great. So what I'd say is there a risk for a micro level of that problem? Yes. Is there a risk of the macro level that we really experienced in spring of 1942? No.
I emailed Admiral Mark Montgomery, retired United States Navy, early this morning after I read the story about the new Chinese carrier and the fifth generation fighter. I thought he was in the Beltway, and instead he's in Hawaii. So I hope I didn't wake up, Admiral. But I laid out a very easy challenge. Can you lay out for my audience what we need to do step by step and in how quickly in order to retain dominance of the underwater realm and have enough Virginia attack submarines to deter a Chinese attack? And it really is, we got 8 minutes for you. Hold forth. You get 8 minutes to educate people on what we need to do now.
Well, thank you for having me to talk about this, because the right person is our mutual friend, Dr. Jerry Hendricks, retired Navy captain, but he's been lured into the White House working for Mike Waltz on exactly this issue. So I'll tell you, step one was hire Jerry Hendricks to try to figure it out. I think I got that one checked. Okay, so step two is you have to resource this properly. And look, our ship, you and I have had this discussion. If you spend 4.5% to 5.5% of our gross domestic product on defense during the Cold War, it dropped precipitously after the Cold War, and then continued to drop through the Obama administration from 4.5% to 3%. President Trump bumped it back up. Under President Biden, it went back down. It is currently 3.02%. So when President Trump tells the Europeans, you better get to three, and you better start thinking about five. I also think there's a value in a mirror in that discussion, because we need to do the same thing. We need to get ourselves from 3% to 3.5% by the end of the Trump 47, and 4% by the end of the next administration after that, because you can't raise it quite that fast. That's talking about bumping in your base budget 40 billion a year. Why do I say you have to start with a big answer like that, Hugh? Because that is what gives you the resources to restore your shipbuilding. That's how bad shipbuilding is. It will take a chunk, about 40% of any of that increase needs to go to the shipbuilding budgets, and it needs to go to getting the people, technology, and processes right at our submarine shipyards that do both new construction and do the repairs, because you kind of alluded to it in a previous discussion, that we don't have a lot of our ships are out of service because they're waiting to be maintained. So we're going to have to put that money into both production and repair of submarines. And I got to tell you, one of the big kickers in this is people. It's having enough STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, educated workforce willing to leave high school or community college and go into the defense industrial base to be welders, to be ship fitters, to be electricians, to build these boats in Connecticut and in Virginia. And we've got to get that STEM workforce right. It's not right. The shipyards aren't ready construction wise to do it. The workforce isn't ready to execute it. We've got to make those investments. That's why the investments we make today will not make 2026 a better warfight. They won't make 2027 a better warfight, but they might make 2030 a better warfight.
So, do we also need expansion of those two uh, submarine building and maintenance facilities? And do we open a third and a fourth, or do we have Australia build them, or South Korea or Japan build them?
So, on nuclear submarines, I would say the answer is yes to expanding the two new construction ones. Yes to considering other shipyards to provide the parts. A lot of this is built modularly. So when I say you might need a third shipyard, it might not be for the fitting, final outfit, and launching. That might still just be at two shipyards. But we're already starting to see other shipyards compete for nuclear work on the nuclear submarines that is then shipped to Virginia and Connecticut. Okay, the reason that's important is I don't think you can get to 3.0 on the current footprints at those two yards, considering that we're also building nuclear aircraft carriers down in Virginia. So, with all that said, it's a qualified yes. More shipyards involved, probably not doing the final outfitting. Australia is also a yes. I think South Korea and South, we already kind of have that deal. I'm hoping President Trump locks that in. So Senator Wicker's talking to him about that. Get the full AUKUS deal of we transfer you some Virginia class and you build new ones there, and you help us get our shipbuilding back in line with investments. Final thing I'd say is Japan and Korea can help us with auxiliary ships, I think, and the construction of the MS military sea lift command ships and the oilers and the other things. I think that's a much more likely assignment for them should we want to give an assignment out to a good ally like Japan or Korea.
Okay, so my very last question, Admiral, and thank you for spending this much time. Can we defend those shipyards? I know the president's talking about strategic defense, and Israel has the Iron Beam coming up. Can we actually defend Virginia and Connecticut? I think are those things that we can make sure, both from external threat and from sabotage and theft.
So yes, but we need to make investments. Look, I think the UAS, the drone problem around them, is more espionage than nefarious attack. But we're going to need to get that right. More broadly, I spoke about Iron Dome last week, and the idea that we really do have to get the investments right in that against an actual attack from China or Russia. So I do think so. But look, we do have to treat these yards. I mean, they're like they are like military forts to us. They're as important as any military fort or naval base or Air Force base in America. They are. We have to look at the defense industrial base as part of the team. They're not adversarial. They are part and parcel, the American warfighting arsenal of democracy. And they're patriots, but they do need to do the physical and cybersecurity that's necessary to defend these key critical assets.
Admiral Mark Montgomery, thank you for spending time with me. I have no idea what time it is in Hawaii, but I appreciate your breaking out from your day to educate the audience. We'll put this up on the YouTube channel as well so it can travel far and wide. And look forward to talking to you when you're back from your travels and update me on what all those people that you're with are saying off the record and in the corner, which is where all the real talking gets done. Thank you, Admiral.
Thank
I
you for
want,
having me, sir.
oh, always. Our longtime sponsor at Job Creators Network and my longtime friend Alfredo Ortiz joins us now because they've launched a brand new initiative which could not be more timely. Really, could not be more timely. Alfredo, how are you?
I am doing great, Hugh. Thank you so much. How are you doing?
I'm great. I want you to tell us about American, I want to get it right, American educationfreedomusa.com. Educationfreedomusa.com. Tell us about it.
Well, Hugh, as you know, the school choice movement has been around for a long time. Unfortunately, the left has co-opted those words. School choice has made it a very bad thing, right? That you're anti-student, anti-teacher, when really what we're trying to do is give parents and the opportunity to do what's best for their children. And so, what Education Freedom USA does, it really nationalizes what's been pretty much a localized or state efforts, really to a national level. So it's very much like a marketing campaign, like a Coca-Cola, right? Where you think national but act local. And it allows for kind of a consolidation of all of these efforts under one umbrella so that the power of the voice is so much broader and so much bigger when you have all the governors, for example, that are now doing in Republican states are pushing for these efforts. It's a very, very powerful way of really getting great ideas out there and really getting them promoted on a national basis now.
I agree. Now, I am often fond of saying this began in West Virginia, I think, but now it's moved to Florida, Ohio,
Right.
Iowa. I'm trying to move east to west and somewhat chronologically. Of course, Arizona's got comprehensive universal school choice, and the folks in Texas are getting ready to vote it. I think Wyoming voted it yesterday. What what kind of resources are available at educationfreedomusa.com?
Well, people will actually understand, which states are have those efforts going, where they, which states actually have, for example, pass it. For example, Tennessee just recently, as you know, Governor Lee there, really pushed for a special session and got it done in terms of getting education freedom passed in his state and others. But one of the things, Hugh, that we have to make sure that we do is we have to sell the wins. And that's part of this campaign, because that's one thing that we tend to forget as Republicans is that it's not only good enough to sell to sell the victory to get to the victory, right? But you have to then sell that victory and sell the win so that people cannot basically co-opt it and try to kill it, which is what tried they do in Arizona. If you remember, after it was passed and Governor Ducey passed it in Arizona, the left basically tried to squash it, but too many parents at that point, almost 120,000 parents or students were participating. It was too late to do anything about it. So that's what we need to do. We got to keep on selling those wins as well.
Yeah, teachers unions, some, maybe all, want to crush this because it makes them work harder, makes their members less secure.
Yeah.
Educationfreedomusa.com. I wonder, Alfredo, you and the Job Creators Network work the Hill very well. My pipe dream, and some maybe it'll come true, is that the reconciliation process says no block grants to any state that does not have a robust school choice at least equal to X, Y, and Z. Any chance of that happening?
Well, we have a part in that as well, that we're working with some of the governors, and also we'll be hopefully working with Secretary McMahon, who I know who had a great morning hearing, and then we're also working with the White House on that, because it's really important to make sure that we do have that the block grants. Look, the states and the parents know best what to do for their kids, and I think that power needs to be handed back to the states, back to the parents especially, and that's what pretty much I think education block grants should be doing. And we don't need a big monstrosity in DC telling our parents how to best do and basically how to teach your own kids.
Educationfreedomusa.com is where you go to become a part of this. And Alfredo, what's the follow up action once someone gets smart at Education Freedom USA?
Well, the big thing is to write your legislators, right? I mean, you got to contact your legislators. People have got to hear. That's what happened in Tennessee. So, I met with Governor Lee in November, about mid-November. He really wanted to get something passed, and we went and we put our efforts together. We took to the radio airwaves. A lot of your colleagues out in Tennessee, local celebrities, and really pushed hard to make sure that parents understood that this was something that Governor Lee was fighting for. And sure enough, it passed. And so we need to do the same thing. We did this in Georgia as well. I mean, the power of being able to, basically muster the voices of all you conservative hosts, which are, if you add up all of your audiences across the conservative network in terms of radio, it's probably 30 million listeners across the country. And so this can be a very, very huge effort. But like I said, we have to make sure that we not only localize these efforts, we got to make sure we nationalize these efforts so that there is a big voice out there. And by the way, there's no bigger voice now on this than President Trump. So thank you, President Trump, for pushing for education freedom.
Education Freedom USA. It's more than 30 million, Alfredo. That's just me, and I guess Mike Gallagher's got like 1 or 2 million. But I mean, you're right. Everybody into the pool. EducationFreedomUSA.com. Alfredo Ortiz of the Job Creators Network. Thank you. Josh Kroshauer is editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider. He joins me now. Josh, I am having trouble keeping up with what we expect on Saturday and what's acceptable to the Israeli government and to the American government. How do you see it?
Well, you are not the only one, Hugh, and a lot of Israelis are in the middle of negotiations and trying to figure out where things currently stand. The latest news is that Hamas has indicated to the Arab negotiators that they're back to the original plan of releasing three hostages, three surviving hostages, as was part of the original for the phase one part of the deal. Now, Donald Trump said this past week that he wanted all the hostages released, and that led Bibi Netanyahu to kind of put out a follow-up statement saying he wanted all the living hostages, which I think amount to 9 total in the first phase, the first stage of this deal. But it does look like Hamas is kind of back to square one and have agreed now, after initially suggesting that they wouldn't release hostages. They're now agreeing to go back to the original terms of the deal that would release 3 surviving hostages this Saturday.
I know that Hamas said that, but they did breach the deal. And anticipatory breach, Israel said, nah, we're not doing that anymore. And can Netanyahu back down from raising the ante? I mean, President Trump will support Israel, whatever they decide to do, which I think is the right choice. But will Netanyahu's government back down?
Well, look, Trump essentially was to the right of Bibi Netanyahu's position in terms of calling for all everyone wants all the hostages to be released, but the worry in Israel, including with his government, is that if things go awry, the hostages could get killed. It's very, very, very delicate situation. So Netanyahu went on television hours after that Trump comment and seemed to indicate that he wanted all the, as I said, all the Israelis that were originally going to be part of the whole phase one deal released. We're now back at the original plan. We'll see what Netanyahu says. Trump hasn't. I saw his comments this afternoon. I don't think he mentioned anything about the latest state of play. But look, it is a very delicate situation, and the worry in Israel is that the hostages could get killed if things do go awry.
Josh, to the best of your knowledge, I'm going to ask Dan Senor this in hour 3. He talked to Yoav Gallant yesterday, and the first part of that interview is dropped. The former Israeli defense minister. First part of Dan's interview is dropped over at Call Me Back Pod. I'm going to ask him as well. To the best of your knowledge, how many of the hostages are still alive?
Most of well, I don't have a number in front of you. I think they're actually I don't want to speak out of turn because I do think that they believe that most of the remaining hostages are still alive, but I don't have a precise number in front of me.
So there are 76 unaccounted for, correct?
That's right. And some of the more high profile hostages, like the Bibas kids, the mother, they're nothing's been publicly acknowledged, but there are fears that the worst has happened in some of the victims' cases.
So that would mean 38 living hostages, and I know that means they have to go slow. But is there an argument in Israel that going fast actually has a better chance of saving them? Because if they're dead, no one's getting out of Hamas alive. And if they're alive, some Hamas might be allowed to leave. What do you think?
Well, I can tell you public opinion. Public opinion in Israel has, especially since Israel has made such significant military gains, taking out Sinwar, taking out a lot of the Hamas military and political leadership. The public opinion has favored doing what it takes to get the hostages home. That's in fact what Trump sort of was calling for, and Steve Witkoff. That was the goal of Witkoff's first visit. Even before Trump took office. So I think you got to be careful with mixed messages, and there's a lot of delicate diplomacy that has taken place both from the Biden to the Trump administrations. Look, public opinion, but what really, and you know this, Hugh, we talked about this last week. What really angered the Israeli public were the images of the last three male hostages who were abused, tortured. They looked emaciated, gaunt. That was what led Trump to make the comments he did in the first place. He said they looked like Holocaust survivors, and that's really angered the Israeli public, and there's this battle between the two tensions at play, which is saving the hostages. But if we go through this whole process, it could also leave Hamas in charge of Gaza. So there's this sort of Hobson's choice going on, where the Israeli public wants to see the hostages come home, but they're also they can't tolerate a Hamas-run Gaza.
Yeah, public impatience ought not to matter in a strategic and a tactical framework because the public doesn't know what's going on. But I did see Defense Minister Katz say the gates of hell are going to open up. And I thought, well, and then I heard from Ambassador Oren and others that the IDF has staged to return in full fury beyond even that which followed 10/7. Did you see those reports as well?
I did some of them, yeah.
So they're going to do that eventually. They're not going to leave Hamas in power.
Well, I mean, the question is, I mean, they've taken out substantial part. I mean, the Sinwar, the leader, gone. A whole lot of the political and military leadership has been killed. The question is like how the challenge. We've talked about this too, Hugh. Is that what happens when you have a majority of your populace that supports Hamas, that supports the terrorism and the awful things we know happen. It's a tension that has been at play, that we've been seeing take place, and the Arab countries.
Well, I got a last question for you, Josh. Do you remember the Sunni awakening in 2007 when the tribes in Iraq had just had it with Zarqawi, and they rose up on the side of the surge? Any chance of that happening in Gaza?
That's a great point, Hugh. I mean, that would maybe be a best case scenario, that the Gazan population would rise up against this extremist totalitarian regime. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that's the way things are going. If anything, there was one reliable public opinion poll of the Palestinians in Gaza that came out about a month ago, and if anything, it showed the opposite, that the public opinion against Israel and support for terrorism has only hardened.
Wow. Josh Kroshauer, I always appreciate you bringing us the facts, even when they're not very, very happy facts. Thank you, Josh. Follow him on X at Josh Kroshauer. You should visit Jewish Insider for the late breaking news on Saturday out of Israel, because we're not going to know until Saturday, 7 o'clock Israel noon our time, what is going to happen next week. I sat down at the desk today, and Dwayne had posted or passed on to me a shocking story: the passing of our dear, dear friend, Dr. David Allen White. Those of you who've listened to the show for its 25 years know Dr. White. Those of you who went on one of the Hugh cruises, 1 through 20, knew Dr. White. Dr. White was actually on the first Hugh cruise, and I wasn't on it. My wife went on it, and Dr. David Allen White, accompanied by his closest friend of many, many years, Patrick McCarthy, went on that first cruise, and then many, many of the cruises thereafter. He was such a magnificent man. If anyone gets a pass right through the pearly gates, it's David Allen White. A Catholic's Catholic, a brilliant scholar, and maybe the best lecturer I've ever heard. That's saying a lot. David could hold an audience unlike anyone I've ever seen. I also visited him at Annapolis, where he taught for many, many years, the mids, and listened to him teach Don Quixote. But mostly he would pick a book, Moby Dick, Dostoevsky, or he would pick a composer And on our cruises, I would do politics and he would do the book or the composer. And the lectures would always be overflowing for him, and not so much for me, but that's fine. Patrick would sometimes lecture too. Together, they were just the dynamic duo. And I agree for Patrick. I don't agree for David. David's in heaven. But I do want you to know, if you're a longtime listener to the show, that Dr. White passed on Monday. And if you have never heard him, I'll make a point to replay our 3-hour Shakespeare introductory lecture. We used to do when I was an afternoon, middle of the day guy. I could do a 3-hour show with one guest, and David Allen White did one on Dickens, and he did one on Shakespeare for me for holidays, and we've got those stored away some way, and we'll have to do an encore. I just want to say, if you didn't ever get to hear him, the most important thing to him was witnessing for his faith in Christ and the Catholic Church. And even though he could talk your ear off about anything you wanted to talk about, and politics was a great rumble, grumble, stumble, storm and thunder, but always cheerful. And it's so ironic or odd or just coincidental. The fetching Mrs. Hewitt and I were talking about David on Monday, because I'm just about to finish Brideshead Revisited. He always urged us to read that. And he gave the DVDs to my son, the BBC DVDs to my son. We were talking about it because I'm about 25 minutes away from the Jeremy Irons narration of Brideshead Revisited. I wanted to save the last 25 minutes. I didn't want to break it up. It's where Charles discusses his faith or lack thereof. I don't know how it turns out. I've never read it, never watched it. But David Allen White swore by that book, swore by Evelyn Waugh, had me read The Departed, had me read Sword of Honor, had me read everything, really. He was a Sherpa to literature and music. So for so many people that he will be greatly missed. And our thoughts and prayers are with Patrick and his family and everybody else who loved him and who will miss him. What I want to tell you about is that President Trump, just held an Oval Office briefing for reporters, took more questions. I mean, he's really just setting the world record for questions of a new president because he knows what he thinks and he's confident about his convictions, so he knows what his answers are going to be. And they're not endless monologues like President Obama, and they're not deeply embarrassing displays of creeping infirmity, as with President Biden. And indeed, they are informed by his first term in his 4 years in the wilderness. Here is cut number 10 from the president in the Oval minutes ago.
From Wall Street about these tariffs. So there's been some nervousness on Wall Street about the impact.
So. I mean, there hasn't been very much, and I think it's going to make the United States stronger, and in many ways, it could make other countries stronger too.
I will check.
Other countries want to have a strong United States. They want to have a strong America, and I think it's going to make us very, very strong, much stronger.
Today, I'll do the market report later, but he's right about today. Anyway, Caitlin Collins up next, cut 11.
And this should have been done by Biden years ago. This should have never been allowed to happen. I know he's a friend of yours.
But couldn't Putin just withdraw his...
He's a friend of
today?
CNN. That's why nobody watches CNN anymore, because they have no credibility. Okay, who else? Yes, please.
Another Caitlin Collins attempt to get a question in cut number 12.
It's President Biden's fault, not President Putin. I mean, he's the one...
I think Biden is incompetent. And I think when he said that they could join NATO, I thought that was a very stupid thing to say. I thought when he said, well, it depends if it's a minor incursion. In other words, it's okay if Russia does a minor incursion. I thought that was a very foolish thing to say.
The
other thing that got it started was how badly Milley and these stupid people, the bad generals, how badly they did with Afghanistan. I was going to pull out, but we were pulling out with dignity and strength, and we were going to take our equipment with us and everything else. They are, I mean, what they're doing is, what they did with that, I think Putin looked at that mess and he said, wow, this is a great time, I'm going to go in. But what the Americans said, I'm not blaming Americans, but I will say what they said had a big influence on his deciding to go in.
Of course, he said a minor incursion. Of course, Joe Biden gave him a green light. And you give Putin an inch, he'll take a mile, and he tried to take all of Ukraine. Cut number 13, the president, again, minutes ago.
Have we talked to any CEOs since the tariffs were announced on steel and aluminum? What's the feedback from those guys?
They are in love with it. As you know, in Pennsylvania, U.S. Steel is through the roof. They're all through the roof. That's why I didn't want U.S. Steel to make a deal with Japan or anybody else. I think it's going to do great. But I think maybe more than anybody else, the steel companies and aluminum companies, they're in love with what's happened. And this will eventually be the car companies and chip companies. We have to have chips made in this country. Right now, everything's made in Taiwan practically, almost all of it, a little bit in South Korea. But everything, almost all of it is made in Taiwan. And we want it to be made. We want those companies to come to our country, in all due respect. You know, they took the business away. Taiwan took our chip business away. We had Intel, we had these great companies that did so well, and it was taken from us, and we want that business back. We want it back in the United States. And if they don't bring it back, we're not going to be very happy.
And you
Sir, on
mentioned
tariffs,
pharmaceuticals as well in China. That's national security to bring that back.
China and other places, we want to get the pharmaceutical and drug business back into the United States, where it should be.
All right, cut number 14.
And I think the farmers are going to be helped by this very much, because product is being dumped into our country, and our farmers are getting hurt very badly by the last administration. The last administration hated our farmers, like at a level that I've never seen before. I think our farmers are going to be helped. Jobs are going to be helped, but our farmers are going to be helped. Our manufacturers are going to be helped. And again, if somebody wants to come in, including the car companies, if they want to come in and build car plants, they'll do it without tariffs, and therefore prices won't go up. There could be some short-term disturbance, but long-term, it's gonna make our country a fortune.
Okay, cut number 15.
I mean, not necessarily, but I'll tell you what will go up is jobs. The jobs will go up tremendously. We're going to have great jobs for everybody. This is something that should have been done many years ago. China did it. I mean, China did it at a level that probably nobody's ever seen before. If you manufactured a car, you couldn't send it into China. The tariff was so high. So everybody went and they built in China. It was no big secret. So we're going to see, but it's going to mean tremendous amounts of jobs. And ultimately, prices will stay the same, go down. But we're going to have a very dynamic country.
I got to say, that's all interesting, but it's not the big news. The big news just broke, and I'll read it to you from The Hill. The headline is, Hardliners Leadership Strike Deal on Budget Resolution Ahead of Key Vote. Hardline conservatives and the House GOP leadership struck an agreement on the conference's budget resolution shortly before a key vote Thursday, putting the measure on a path to advance out of committee if it holds. According to House Freedom Caucus Chair Andy Harris, the agreement, which still has to be approved by the House Budget Committee, would allow Representative Jody Arrington, the chair of the Budget Committee, to adjust the dials and increase the cap on the deficit impact of the tax portion of President Trump's priorities. If additional spending cuts are made in other areas, it would give teeth to the $2 trillion deficit reduction target outlined in the bill that was key for fiscal hawks. Harris said, if the agreement, which could be brought up as a manager's amendment, passes, the House Freedom Caucus will support the budget resolution, a serious boost to the House's chances of approving the framework for, quote, one big beautiful bill of Trump's priorities on the floor after weeks of hardline conservatives jockeying over spending cut demands. Advancing the budget resolution out of committee is the first step towards unlocking the process Republicans want to pass Trump's legislative priorities without Democratic vote. This is it. We declare victory, Harris said. I mean, we have a bill that we believe had to be done rapidly to get the president the border funding as soon as possible. We believe it had meaningful deficit reduction, and we believe it had to be able to advance the president's tax priorities. It all happens here. Arrington released a budget resolution Wednesday that outlines a $1.5 trillion floor for spending cuts across committees with a target of $2 trillion, a $4.5 trillion cap on the deficit impact of the Republicans' plan to extend Trump's 2017 tax cuts, and $300 billion in additional spending for the border and defense. Conservatives, however, were in favor of additional spending cuts, while members of the Ways and Means Committee had pushed for a higher cap to enact Trump's tax agenda. Under the agreement, Arrington would be able to adjust the spending cuts floor and tax impact cap when crafting the budget reconciliation package. Harris said the traditional mechanism of a reserve fund will enable the chair to adjust the dials. For example, the deficit reduction floor set at $1.5 trillion and a target of $2 trillion. If committee finds $2.5 trillion in reduction, Arrington can allow Ways and Means to design policy that raise the deficit increase allowance from $4.5 to $5 trillion. enabling the committee more flexibility to address Trump's demands for tax cuts. Importantly, Harris said the amendment would also require the budget chair to lower deficit increase allowances for the tax portion if the $2 trillion target is not reached, meaning the allowance for tax cuts and other priorities would be curtailed. The manager's amendment already seems to be winning over some hardliners on the Budget Committee, which is tasked with advancing the budget resolution as the first step in the reconciliation process. Representative Chip Roy, I'm still reading from the Hill. Representative Chip Roy, a member of both the Freedom Caucus and the Budget Committee, called the House GOP's budget resolution a giant step forward in markup Thursday, signaling he will support the measure when it comes up for a key vote later today. The budget put forward by the chairman is a giant step forward to reduce spending, the primary driver of the inflation and the expansion of government largesse that is strangling the future of our children and grandchildren, Roy said. I am proud of what the chairman has put forward. Asked by the Hill what had changed overnight for the budget resolution to earn his support, the Texas Republican, Chip Roy, said, quote, sufficient commitment was to spending restraint has me optimistic I can support the end result. Roy's comments mark a significant shift from Wednesday night, when the Texas Republican was holding out support for the resolution. Roy told reporters at the time he still had questions on a number of matters, including spending cuts, rolling back energy subsidies, and the upcoming appropriations process. Representative Ralph Norman, another Freedom Caucus member who sits on the Budget Committee, also appeared to be in position to support the resolution on Thursday. The South Carolina Republican told reporters Wednesday that he did not support the resolution in its current position, saying he wanted Medicaid work requirements back. Republicans are looking to use reconciliation. Of course they are. Republicans can afford only to lose 2 GOP votes in the Budget Committee and still have the resolution advanced. They're going to get the resolution. They're going to get it. Let me just say that a 10-year extension of President Trump's expiring provisions over $4.7 trillion, according to the Congressional Budget Office, Smith said earlier in the week. Harris, though, has not talked to Smith about the deal. All right, what do I care about most? What I talked about with Admiral Montgomery. At least $150 billion in defense spending increase. That's the $40 billion a year that Admiral Montgomery said before this story broke. They're going to get it all in one big, beautiful bill. Go, Mike Johnson, go. And the Senate will go along. It's going to happen. I'm feeling good, and I'm happy. I'm happy because the House is going to pass one big, beautiful bill, and that one big, beautiful bill is going to add $150 billion to our defense budget. You can't just throw money at a problem, as Admiral Montgomery said, and I don't know if that's posted yet at my YouTube channel, but it's a 3-part interview with Admiral Mark Montgomery, retired. It's up at the YouTube channel. Good. When you go over to watch that, like and subscribe, please. I would appreciate that. But what he laid out is we need $40 billion increase every year for the Trump administration and for the next administration in order to get to above 3.5% GDP, closing in on 4% GDP. And I just checked the Spider for aerospace and defense, XAR, and it was down $1.50 today, and it's up in after-hour trading 3 and change because it's happening. Defense is going to get a build up. We're all going to get what we need. Tax cuts going to go forward. Spending cuts are coming. It's going to work. And the economy, time for the market report, always brought to you by AmericanFederal.com. Nick Grovich and his team can be reached at 1-800. Let me make sure I get the number right. 1-800, because I don't want to get it wrong. 1-800-221-7694. The reason I don't want to get it wrong is his phones are ringing off the hook. Now, more people are selling him gold than buying gold right now. And that's just the effect of 4 years of Joe Biden and the Democrats. 1-800-221-7694. You get in touch with Nick Grovich. You go to AmericanFederal.com. Gold, well, let me do the whole market thing. The Dow was up 0.77. And by the way, the news of the deal didn't break until after the markets closed. But anyway, the Dow was up 0.77. The S&P was up 1%. NASDAQ up 1.5%. And gold went up $29 and change today to $2,957. Big institutions are buying gold. Not onesies and twosies, send me 5 ounces of gold, but big institutions. But that's driving up the price of gold. You know what that does? That gets people to go look in their closet and get grandma's gold chain, take a picture of it, send it to Nick, or talk to Nick at 1-800-221-7694. Now, you don't get 2,957 times the number of ounces that your grandma's gold chain weighs, even if it's the real deal, 24 karat. What is the real deal, Dwayne? You used to be a jeweler. What would actually translate into a real deal gold ounce?
Well, 30 years ago, back when I was in, it was about 400 an ounce.
No, but I'm not talking about price. I mean, is it 14 karat or 24 karat? What's it got to be real gold?
Well, 24 karat is nugget out of the ground gold. You don't make jewelry out of it. You make jewelry out of 18 karat gold. That's the really good stuff. Some European or some Middle Eastern gold is 6 karat because they like to.
Yeah, this is a radio show, Anatol. You got to talk into the microphone.
I am right here in the microphone.
It's just fading. I just want you to turn away.
There is 14 karat gold, which is the U.S. standard, and there's 10 karat gold for people that are cheap.
So 14 karat gold, they don't just weigh it and send you the number of ounces that they weigh times $2,957. They
No,
take the commission. They also have to make sure it's not real pure gold.
It's not pure gold. It's 1424, so it's like 58.5% gold.
So
it's 42% other stuff.
I want people to understand. Nick's not gonna, if your necklace weighs 10 ounces and it's 14 karat gold, he's not going to say, "Oh, you get 10 ounces times 2,957."
Right. There's a
minus
calculation.
my 10%.
There's a calculation for it to give you the gold value based upon the weight and what grade of gold
But
it is.
Nick will be fair.
Sure.
He will explain that. And Dwayne actually knows what he's talking about here, because were you a certified gemologist or whatever they call it?
I was a certified gemologist. Yes.
Gemologist?
Yes.
Gemologist or gemologist?
Gemologist.
Okay. And Sinister Dell was the real deal. He worked at it.
He was a watchmaker. He did most of the front end stuff and did watch repair.
How is Sinister Dell doing?
He's fine. He's freezing his.
I know he's in Kansas.
He's in Kansas where they actually had snow, and
You're
he's
not
not
in
used to
Kansas
this.
anymore, Dell, but is he listening?
I don't know.
All right. Dell, hello. Hope you're doing well. I hope your son didn't embarrass you right there. Because Dwayne quit before his apprenticeship was over.
That's not true.
The
I was there for
apprenticeship
8
would have
years.
been 15 years.
I was there for 8 years.
I know, but Dell told me offline that it would have been 15 years to make you into a jeweler. So I'm just telling you, if you want to know what your old jewelry is worth, give Nick Rovich a call. And it's worth more than it ever was before. 1-800-221-7694. If you want, we don't do that. I just buy gold every January. So I bought 3 ounces from Nick in January, and yes, it's gone up. And it doesn't matter to me because I don't ever intend to sell it. It's in the safety deposit box. It'll probably end up in the safety deposit box for as long as either the fetching Mrs. Hewitt and I do not slip the mortal coils. And if you want a great person to work with, the reason I begged Nick to be the sponsor is because Nick is fair, transparent, and doesn't play the float. Some people are like Nick. Other people are really not like Nick. But what I'm really excited about is what's going to happen tomorrow. Doug Burgum, my favorite. Look, there are a lot of great cabinet members. Love Pete, love Pam, love all these people. And I told you after Gates parachuted off the plane, didn't take the plane down, I said everyone's going to get confirmed. And I'm right. Everyone's going to get confirmed. But RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard were the two about which I said, no, they're all going to get confirmed. And Elbridge Colby's going to get confirmed for reasons Mark Montgomery discussed. Everyone's going to get confirmed. But my favorite member of the cabinet is Doug Burgum. And that's because this guy is so scary smart. Cut number 8, the former North Dakota governor, now the Secretary of the Interior, chair of the National Energy Council, member of the National Security Council on Fox News today. Cut number 8.
President Trump, it was fantastic being a governor underneath him in my first term and back in the first Trump administration. But he's operating at a next level right now. I mean, the first time around, he was courageous. This time, he's fearless. The ideas he has that he's driving forward on cutting waste and spending, being with them, whether it's at a national prayer breakfast, renaming the Gulf of America, or negotiating with the Prime Minister of Japan about an 800-mile natural gas pipeline in Alaska. Everything he's doing is 180 degrees different from the Biden administration, and he's delivering on all the promises, and that's fantastic. And one of those promises was he was going to make government more efficient. And I'm a complete supporter of this. When I became governor of North Dakota, we cut 27% out of the general fund. I know it can be done. This example you just talked about at Iron Mountain is we've got to give people that work in government the tools. The technology is so outdated that we're asking people to do paperwork instead of computer work.
Uh-oh. Put up the bat signal for Selena Zito. Put up because she's going to have to go wrestle Doug Burgum for Iron Mountain. Stephen Miller on Fox with Laura Ingraham last night. Cut one.
President Trump has already saved thousands of lives just by the people he's kept out of the country these last 3 weeks. Do you have any idea how many criminals, how many potential terrorists, how many security threats have been blocked and denied and prevented and deterred from even trying to enter the country? A 95% reduction in illegal crossings. There are mothers all over this country who will sleep safely tonight because of what Donald Trump has done. That is what the American people voted for, not the chaos and bloodshed of Gavin Newsom and Kathy Hochul and all of these blue state governors and blue state mayors who have forced their people to live in violence and misery.
Thank you, Assistant to President Miller. He is often even more emphatic than I am, but emphasis matters. When Donald Trump is messaging, his assistants ought to message just as effectively, and Stephen Miller did. I rarely draw the fetching Mrs. Hewitt into the world of politics. She's political to a little bit, but she's not anything like me. But I said, you have to watch this last night because our son worked at EPA. I dealt with EPA forever. Scott Pruitt was a friend of mine. Andrew Wheeler was a friend of the program. Lee Zeldin is the new EPA administrator. I've never had Lee on the program. He's a fabulous communicator. He released a video last night, and I'm just going to play it for you because I was stunned, as was FMH. Cut number 4.
Hi, this is EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin. One of my very top priorities at EPA is to be an excellent steward of your hard-earned tax dollars. There will be zero tolerance of any waste and abuse. An extremely disturbing video circulated 2 months ago featuring a Biden EPA political appointee talking about how they were tossing gold bars off the Titanic, rushing to get billions of your tax dollars out the door before inauguration day. The gold bars were tax dollars, and tossing them off the Titanic meant the Biden administration knew they were wasting it. Following this revelation, during my meetings with members of Congress, I made a very important commitment to them and to the American people, which I reiterated at my confirmation hearing that if confirmed, I would immediately get a full accounting. Fortunately, my awesome team at EPA has found the gold bars. Shockingly, roughly $20 billion of your tax dollars were parked at an outside financial institution by the Biden EPA. This scheme was their first of its kind in EPA history, and it was purposely designed to obligate all of the money in a rush job with reduced oversight. Even further, this pot of $20 billion was awarded to just 8 entities that were then responsible for doling out your money to NGOs and others at their discretion with far less transparency. Just under $7 billion was sent to one entity called the Climate United Fund. I'm sure you and I now have some of the same questions. How do these organizations decide how to allocate funding? How much money have they given out so far and to whom? Are there any former Biden EPA staffers who are now working at these entities? Let me make one thing abundantly clear. At this point, there is zero reason to suspect any wrongdoing by the bank. Here's my position as EPA administrator. The financial agent agreement with the bank needs to be instantly terminated, and the bank must immediately return all of the gold bars that the Biden administration tossed off the Titanic. EPA needs to reassume responsibility for all of these funds. We will review every penny that has gone out the door. I'll be referring this matter to the Inspector General's office, and will work with the Justice Department as well. The days of irresponsibly shoveling boatloads of cash to far-left activist groups in the name of environmental justice and climate equity are over. The American public deserves a more transparent and accountable government than what transpired these past 4 years. We take our obligations under the law as seriously as it gets. I've directed my team to find your gold bars, and they found them. Now we will get them back inside of control of government as we pursue next steps. As President Trump has vowed, We are going to usher in a new golden age of American success for the citizens of every race, religion, color, and creed.
That is the way you communicate. Number one, you do it direct to camera. You'll let the reporters in later. I got a lot of questions, but I got to tell you, that was a stunner. And I remind people that it is a 5-year felony, up to 5 years in jail, if you make a false statement to a federal official investigating Operation Gold Bars from the Titanic. Maybe everyone's lawyering up who was involved in this scam, the recipients and the givers. Yeah, we're going to find it all out. Thank you, Administrator Zeldin. Andrew Kerr of the Washington Free Beacon has been spending a lot of time out here. Andrew, welcome to the program. I have in my hand a story that says Gavin Newsom said the wildfire team he disbanded was inadequately trained. His own administration gave it an award for outstanding performance. Tell us about Team Blaze. And by the way, congratulations on your reporting, Andrew. You found stories I didn't know were there.
Thanks, Hugh, for having me on. Yeah, so the Newsom administration last year disbanded a volunteer firefighting team called Team Blaze. It was a group of about 150 trained firefighters with the California State Guard, which is a militia force that reports to Newsom as their commander-in-chief. Now, Team Blaze, their members at their own cost, own expense, attended monthly firefighting trainings, and they were deployed. It was created in 2020, and they were deployed to the 2021 Dixie Fire, which was the largest in state history. They saved lives. Were awarded for exemplary performance. And last year, the Newsom administration just shut the unit down. And what Team Blaze provided California National Guard was a standby force of Type 2 hand crews. So in wildfire firefighting, there's Type 1 hand crews, which are the hot shots. They are on the front lines. And then there's the Type 2 hand crews that are in the background working to prevent further spread of the fire. So when Team Blaze was disbanded, the National Guard had no standby force of Type 2 hand crews, which meant when the Los Angeles fires broke out, the California National Guard had to send 200 soldiers about 220 miles north of the city to train at Camp Roberts to learn how to perform the duties of a Type 2 hand crew. That training lasted 10 days, and so those soldiers arrived in the city on January 17th, 10 days later. The former commander of the State Guard, General Jay Kogan, he told me that if Team Blaze had not been disbanded, his firefighters could have been on the ground day one, performing those Type 2 hand crew duties that were obviously needed by virtue of the fact that California had to train them from scratch.
Andrew, one of the big storylines, I'm in LA, so I know this because I watch the local news, is that we were getting firefighter help from Nigeria, from Mexico. People were flying in from around the world, but we didn't have Team Blaze. It's just crazy. We took weeks to get people from around the world here, and Team Blaze wasn't there. Did they give you a reason why they were disbanded?
No, it goes deeper than that. So it was an all-volunteer force. This came at virtually no cost to California. These firefighters, they trained on their own dime. There was an outside charity called the California State Guard Foundation that, at no cost to the state, helped cover the training costs for these firefighters, provide equipment and training for them. And California only had to pay these guys when they were actively deployed to fight fire. So it was a really good deal for California. In 2023, before they shut the unit down, the California National Guard issued a ruling deeming it illegal for Team Blaze and the California State Guard to receive free charitable funds from this outside charity. And when I asked the California National Guard about this last year, they were proud about it. They said, yes, we stopped this illegal practice thanks to efforts by Major General Matt Beavers, who is Newsom's appointee to lead the California National Guard. So, I mean, it's just, it's wild that
I have a guess.
They had this really good...
I have a guess based on living and working here as a lawyer from 1989 to 2016. One of the public employee unions sensed a threat in the concept of volunteer forces supplementing and maybe taking away from their overtime, not realizing that in a disaster that doesn't matter. What do you think of my hunch, Andrew? That's not a reported fact, that's a hunch.
Yes, one of my sources who used to be a firefighter in Team Blaze told me that there was pressure from the firefighting unions in California, which I understand are very powerful,
Yes,
that
they
were essentially lobbying to, they have these volunteer guys and very qualified. They were rewarded for their life-saving work in prior years, kind of interfering with their turf. The other angle to this, though, is that the former commander of the State Guard, Jay Kogan, he happens to be a Jewish attorney, and my reporting has shown that Newsom's appointee to lead the California National Guard, General Matt Beavers, has faced allegations of saying wildly anti-Semitic things in private conversations about Jay Kogan and other Jewish subordinates under his command. And so there's also this angle that that the National Guard, the Newsom administration, has retaliated against the State Guard and really dismantled this really unique volunteer force that California has at its disposal, kind of designed to help the state combat natural disasters. The fact that it was led by a Jewish commander that they were retaliated against for having that connection.
Has that allegation been substantiated by the commander of Team Blaze? Has he commented in public on it?
So Matt Beaver's predecessor, David Baldwin, told there's a California Military Department Inspector General investigation into this. And so the predecessor, Dave Baldwin, said on the record that, Matt Beaver said these anti-Semitic things. But the Newsom administration swept the allegations under the rug because Dave Baldwin did not write a written report to himself documenting that he had heard these things directly from the Newsom appointee, Matt Beavers, and did not write a report, just kind of memorializing that.
Has General Beavers talked to you?
Excuse me?
Has General Beavers talked to you, Andrew Kerr?
No, I've reached out to him several times. I know that he got my
how about Gavin?
Messages. But...
Had Gavin talked to you?
Well, when I reported that the details surrounding Team Blaze being disbanded, the Newsom press office responded publicly on Twitter, now known as X, that this was a inadequately trained volunteer force, and we turned them into something better. Now, let's just review the facts here. This is these are heroic firefighters that were awarded specifically for the training that they underwent and for their performance on the field.
Well, I read this story, and we're out of time, Andrew Kerr, but I want everyone to go to Andrew Kerr NC on X, follow the trail, read everything. He's a superb reporter working for Eliana Johnson and Vic Mattis over at the Washington Free Beacon, doing stuff that, of course, the LA Times, a hollow shell of a newspaper, doesn't do. Andrew, thank you for joining me. I'll be right back, America. Dan Senor got the scoop of scoops over at Call Me Back Pod. I'll play a little bit of it, and then I'm going to talk to Dan Senor next hour. Dan Senor is coming up next hour to talk about his exclusive interview with former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Here's a small sample of part one of Dan Senor Call Me Back podcast with Yoav Gallant. Cut number 2.
Yoav, I want to now move to what I think history may judge as what could have been one of the most decisive or consequential days of the war, certainly in the days after October 7th, and that's the day is October 11th. And you were already contemplating, since Hezbollah had already started attacking on October 8th, you and the senior command of the IDF were contemplating or planning for what could be done against this emerging northern front.
Well, let me start by saying that this dramatic day could have changed the course of the war and the way that we deal in this war. We understood, according to the intel, that their goal is to split Israel between Hezbollah and between Hamas. If you fight against few enemies, start with a stronger one, otherwise you will be exhausted. Now, the most important thing is what could have happened. We could have eliminated all the chain of command of Hezbollah immediately. Then, once we start to maneuver into the battlefield, as we did the next year, 15,000 terrorists would have put their vest with a walkie-talkie on their chest. In this walkie-talkie, there was 3 times more explosives that we had in the beepers later on. Once you initiate it, you kill 15,000 terrorists in one strike. The meaning is, if we were taking this opportunity and use it against Hezbollah, we could have eliminated all the leadership, all the missiles and the rockets, and most of their fighters. The meaning is that there is no Hezbollah physically. If there is no Hezbollah, you take divisions and brigades and send them from the north to the south. So you can work simultaneously in Gaza, in Khan Yunis, and Rafah. So you can shorten the war into half or 1/3. Second, you don't have to evacuate communities from the north because no one is there. Well, I came back to the Prime Minister and said, we must do it. He was pointing to Tel Aviv from his office to the buildings around us, and he said, you see all these buildings? Nothing will survive because of the retaliation of Hezbollah after you attack them. And I wasn't that pessimistic. This is something we could have done on October 11 and eliminate Hezbollah, and we didn't use it.
We didn't use it. Coming up, Dan Senor explains how he scored that interview and the key things. It's a two-parter. Head over to Call Me Back podcast to hear the entire conversation. It's going to be controversial, going to make a lot of headlines. And, of course, Dan Senor pulls his weight always in these interviews. It will not be a softball. We'll talk about that coming up in Studio West, where it's 2 p.m. in California, 5 p.m. inside the Beltway. And in Israel, it's just past midnight as Friday has begun in Israel. I believe most Israelis will already have listened to Dan Senor's latest podcast. Dan Senor, of course, the host of the Call Me Back podcast and a regular friend of our show. Dan, welcome and congratulations on getting former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant to sit down with you. That had to be a pretty tough nut to crack. Oh, you're not hearing me yet, Dan. It's unfortunate because we're working on it. I will come back. I'll tell you that part 1 is already posted. I have not listened to it yet. I'm going to do my best to get it absorbed completely over the weekend. I'm going to wait for part 2 to drop so I can listen to them back to back. And on Saturday, as we wait for whatever follows next in Israel, I'll be at least informed on what Yoav Gallant. I played for you, if you were listening to last hour, the first 3 minutes of the episode that has been dropped as a teaser. And Yoav Gallant says in that 3 minutes that he proposed on October 8th that Israel strike Hezbollah. That was an idea we first heard on this program, floated by Dr. Michael Oren, former ambassador of Israel to the United States. And he said so at the time that if he had his druthers, the IDF would go north, not south, after the attack on 10/7. One of the questions I hope Dan asked former Minister Gallant is, given how it has worked out, Hezbollah crippled, Assad gone, Iran on its heels. There he is. Dan Senor, welcome. Good to see you.
Hey, Hugh. Sorry about that little technical glitch.
It happened. It happened.
It happened.
I
Happens to
began.
the best
How
of us.
tough was it to book Minister Gallant, former Defense Minister Gallant?
Well, I've gotten to know him a little bit over the last 16 months. I met him for the first time in January of 25, just a few months after the war started. And I obviously made it clear to him that anytime he wanted to talk to an international audience, we'd be happy to have him on the podcast. He actually didn't do any media interviews in Israel or anywhere else during the entirety of his service as defense minister during the war. He just did briefings, but no, wouldn't do any sit downs because he just didn't think it was appropriate. And then when he left office, I was still in touch with him, and I visited with him in Israel. I visited with him on a couple of visits he made to New York, and he had made a decision he was going to do two big Hebrew language interviews. And I told him, if you want to do a long form interview, I would explore the issues and decisions he had to make in a way I don't think he would do in a 7-minute television interview. And as you can see from the interview we did, he goes deep. So he has a series of these decisions that were made in periods during the war where he He wants to go deep. This conversation that we had we recorded on Friday is over an hour, and that was just dealing with 4 days, the first 4 days of the war. And he intends to have a series of these conversations with me, and he thinks it's the only way to really explore these topics.
Now, Dan, in my intro to this conversation, I said it's after midnight, early Friday morning in Israel. But I was going to bet that most of Israel has already downloaded part 1 of Dan Senor's conversation with Yoav Gallant. And I don't want to know your download numbers. I just want to know if I'm right about that. Are people already reacting to you on your text messages? Yeah.
Yeah. It's yes. The reaction has been extraordinary. I think for a couple of reasons. One, what Yoav, General Gallant, does in this interview is he really takes you behind the scenes. So like you really get a sense of how these decisions are being made in real time in the room, in the Kiryat, which is where sort of the command center for Israel's war in the heart of Tel Aviv. So there's basically 3 people who have seen all aspects of the war since October 7th. It's Prime Minister Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and then the chief of staff who just stepped down, Herzl Halevi. That's it. It's 3 people. And so he really takes you in the room for how these decisions are made, both intra-Israeli government decisions, how he's working with Secretary Austin in the Biden administration, which is interesting. So I think that is, powerful, and people were struck by it. 2, he also provides some counterfactual history, which he lays out a decision he advocated that he was overruled on, but he actually believes would have changed the course of the war. And that's very interesting. And 3, I just don't think people really know him, Hugh. He's not a real recognized in Israel. He is. When you're with him in Israel, he's like one of the most recognized people. But outside of Israel, people don't really know him. So I just think just getting to know this guy, who has had an extraordinary career in Israeli public life and military life, and will probably have a future, people have just been moved by it.
Now, Dan, I told people already, I played 3 minutes of the interview last hour to tease you're sitting down with me. I think I know what the lead is, but I don't want to bury the lead. What is the lead? I'm saving both Call Me Backs, that's a 2-parter, for Saturday on my long run because I want to listen to them back to back and I don't know Yoav Gallant from Adam. I recognize him, but I've never talked to him. I have talked to Netanyahu. I talk to Oren every week. I talk to Haviv. I talk to you, but I've never talked to him. What's the lead?
I would say there are 2 leads. There's probably more than 2, but the ones that jumped out at me, 3, I would say, the most. Here we go. You wanted 1.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah. Right. I would say the first is Yoav Gallant argued that on October 11th, so 4 days before October 7th, he had learned of a meeting that was going to be happening in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, among the senior leadership of the entire senior command of Hezbollah, including Hassan Nasrallah. And he believed that by October 8th, Hezbollah had made it clear that it was joining the war. So Hezbollah is already hitting Israel on October 8th. So he basically says, we're in a 2-front war. What Hamas did was awful, but they are actually the weaker enemy. The more dangerous enemy for us is Hezbollah, for Israel. And as he quotes Clausewitz, he says, if you are facing 2 enemies at 2-front war, you expend your energy on the front end against the tougher enemy. At some point, you're going to have to fight both of them, but the tougher one's going to be harder to fight. Get them done early and quick. And he believed that Israel should have moved on Hezbollah right away. And he lays out a plan for how he advocated doing it, which he could never talk about before recent months, which was he knew all about obviously he was very involved with the pagers that blew up and the walkie-talkies. So he had this plan that basically he knew of this meeting that was happening on October 11th in Lebanon. He wanted Israel to strike the location, the Air Force to strike the location where that meeting was happening, kill Nasrallah and all the senior command, and then start taking out all the missile arsenal, the rocket arsenal. So, they had like 200,000 rockets and missiles. And Israel had very good intelligence on where they were, as we now know. So he wanted to take out the senior command and start taking out the Hezbollah arsenal. And he believed once they did that, Hezbollah would say, it's time to escalate, and they would have activated their soldiers to invade Israel. Their soldiers meaning they're terrorists. They're terrorists who fight in terrorists. I mean, they are terrorists. I'm putting soldiers in air quotes, and that they would have activated about 15,000 of these terrorists in their army that they had ready to go. Now, here's the key part. This is why he could have never talked about this before. They knew they had 4,000 pagers in Hezbollah. Israel did, that had the explosives. They had about 15,000 of those walkie-talkies. The walkie-talkies are bigger than the pagers, which means they carry more explosives, which means instead of just taking someone off the battlefield temporarily like the pagers did, it could actually kill whoever is near the walkie-talkie. They also knew Hezbollah had these army vests, these military vests, with a pocket for walkie-talkies over the heart. So when they go to invade, they grab the vests and they put in the walkie-talkies. So he thought, you go in, you take out the senior command. You go out and you go in and you take out most of the rocket and missile arsenal. Hezbollah says it's on, and we're activating a ground invasion. Hezbollah activates 15,000 of its terrorists to go grab their vests, their guns, and go invade. And then Israel activates the explosives in the walkie-talkies and kills 15,000 Hezbollah fighters. And he basically says with the combination of those three moves, they've removed the threat from the north. This is before Israel's evacuated most of its 60,000 residents from northern Israel. So it would have not been necessary to remove that whole population. It would have basically taken Hezbollah off the battlefield early on, and it would have kept Hamas isolated, alone, and it would have not had the Israeli army distracted fighting two fronts, and the army could then just focus on Hamas in the south.
Your interviewing style with someone like Yoav Gallant, do you let them talk, or do you propose counterfactuals such as, do you know it's all worked out pretty well and Assad is gone, so even though your very good plan, and it was proposed by Michael Oren publicly at the time, and he didn't know about the pagers and the walkie-talkies, or maybe he didn't tell me. But how do you do the interview when you hear something that piques your interest? You just let them go?
My inclination, Hugh, in these situations is to let the guest talk. He is one of the three most consequential leaders in the decision-making behind one of the most consequential wars of our lifetime. I don't need to keep interrupting him. He has a lot to say that he hasn't said, and he's put a lot of thought into what he wants to say. And I challenge him here and there if there's something glaring, but not in a gotcha kind of. I'm not there to debate him. I'm there to, he's letting us be a fly on the wall in his decision making. Let's hear what it was like behind those walls, within those four walls. And I had the same approach with Prime Minister Netanyahu. When I interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu last spring, a lot of people, gave me a hard time for not being more confrontational with him. And I said, again, he's one of the most important, love him or hate him, Bibi Netanyahu is one of the most consequential leaders of our lifetime. And he's here to talk, and we should listen. And like I said, if there's something very specific, something very glaring, a couple things with Netanyahu I challenged him on, but I'm not there. That's not my, like I said, a couple things fine, but I'm not there to do just back and forth. It's
one of my catch lines. I've interviewed Donald Trump 30 times in 10 years. And I don't think I've ever fact checked. And I'll tell him, I'll insert, I disagree with you on that when we talk, for example, about 2020. And he knows, and he rolls on. But my view is it's an interview, not a debate. If we want to have a debate, we'll have a debate. But I don't want to debate the president or the former president or the president-elect or the president again. And when you have Netanyahu or Gallant, you're actually getting history's first draft for you. Is that in your mind? As much as possible, let him talk.
Absolutely. I mean, when you listen to this here, he really provides specifics, and really, you really get a sense for what was happening, and why on earth would I want to chop that up and start? Like I said, if he's making like a sort of an advocacy point, and I disagree with it, it's one thing to challenge him or respond, but when he's just doing storytelling about what was happening in the room, I wasn't in the room. He was in the room. So what exactly am I challenging him on? So I feel strongly, you're right. It's a first draft of history. Let the man tell it.
That is completely, we are in complete agreement on how to interview people who make history, not debate history. Dan got the scoop of scoops. You got to sit down with former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and talk to him for a two-part interview, which is dropped at his podcast, Call Me Back, to which you should like and subscribe. We got the first lead in part one, Dan. Part two is really just about technique. Well, this is our third and final part. What are the other two leads?
So just before I close the loop on the first one I just addressed, what Gallant argues is, and you can hear it in the podcast, but he basically lays out, had they confronted Hezbollah early, he thinks they could have sliced the war in terms of timeline in half. But I'll let listeners listen for themselves about how persuasive that is. I found it pretty persuasive. The second lead was him talking about his dealings with Defense Secretary Austin and the Biden administration. And you get the early signs. We're going to dedicate. In fact, I spoke to Yoav today, and I thought we were kicking around ideas for, we were talking about that we're going to do a series of these conversations. And he's talked to me in the past about the U.S.-Israel relationship because he lived it during wartime. And let's just say he has a lot to say about how the U.S. administration tried to manage Israel's war. And you even see in this conversation, because in this conversation, we're just focused on the first 4 days of the war. And even in the first 4 days, you see Gallant trying to persuade Austin to get some munitions that had been pre-positioned in Israel by the U.S. before October 7th, had been taken out to be sent to Ukraine, but they were still in Europe, and he wants them back, and he's got to persuade Gallant. And Gallant's like, why? Austin is saying, why do you need all these munitions? You're just fighting Hamas. And he says, you have no idea what we're fighting. This is the Middle East. Things are going to get hot all over the place. And he was right. And so we start to see the early signs of the U.S. trying to, and he's not happy. Austin is not happy with Gallant when Gallant tells him we're going to get Nasrallah, and then also when he tells them we're taking out Hania. They don't give the Biden administration a ton of warning, but they give him some warning. And Austin and the Biden people are not happy about it.
Oh wow!
And then the other lead is, and we're going to, in future conversations, we're going to get deeper into that topic, just how his dealings with the U.S. And then the other lead, Hugh, and this moved me almost to tears. He goes, I think it was in January of 2025. I think it was then. Maybe it was a little before that. He goes down to the kibbutzim, to those communities in southern Israel that were completely rocked and wrecked by Hamas. And I've been to these kibbutzim, and they're empty, like nobody's there. And he's touring there, and one resident was there, and this woman in Kibbutz Nir Oz, which is a kibbutz where 25%, 1 out of every 4 residents of the kibbutz, were either murdered on October 7th or taken hostage. I've been there 2 or 3 times. And he's there, and a woman is there who lost 6 members of her family on October 7th. And she confronts him. She walks up to him. And there's someone from the Israeli press there, and they capture the whole thing, and they film this woman confronting him. And we play the video of this woman confronting him in the episode. If you watch on YouTube, you can actually see it. It's one of the most dramatic images I've ever seen of a wartime leader dealing with, the people they're ultimately accountable to, a resident of the country whose life was ruined by Israel's failure to defend these communities on October 7th. And I don't want to get it, I want your listeners to see this or listen to it, but you hear and see in this man as he's responding to this woman like a real leader. I mean, just I can't imagine in a million years being in his shoes during any part of this war, but especially during that moment when he's standing there dealing with a woman whose life was ruined because she believes he and the IDF were not there when her life was turned upside down.
Dan, I'm going to listen to both of these on Saturday as we await for news of whether or not the war is resumed, hostages, that sort of thing. So I would recommend to everyone be informed, whether you love the guy, hate the guy, whatever. It is like talking to George C. Marshall in the early days of World War II, maybe the first year of World War II. Did you yet get to the Concepcia? I mispronounce it all the time.
You pronounce it properly.
Okay, did you get to the Concepcia with him in the air?
No. So just for your listeners, this is the concept. They called it the Concepcia. What Israel had a Concepcia, a concept of why they did not believe Hamas would attack Israel anytime soon, and obviously it was completely wrong, and Israel was completely manipulated by Hamas into believing that a war was not coming. And we did not get into that. We really just focused on the first 4 days. I think we'll do an episode. We're going to do a series of conversations, and one of the ones I think we should do is all the signs that they got wrong before October 7th, which is, that is the Concepcia.
Dan, I appreciate the way you approach your interviews with this, because it's very rare to establish a level of trust that a major historical figure will talk to you at length and repeatedly in order to establish their record, which can be debated. And you've got Prime Minister already talking to you. Do you know when you're going to go back for the next one? And when does part 2 drop? I know part 1's up.
So part 2 we don't have a date yet for part 2. So part 1 is out, and it's longer than our normal episodes. It's about twice the length. So part 1 is out, and part 2 will probably be sometime in March. I'll let you know when we release it. But I think the tempo for now, we're talking about it. I think we're going to probably do one conversation a month for the next few months. We may pick up the tempo. It depends. But as you'll see from this first episode, it's like listening to an audiobook. I mean, it's a real meaty conversation where he kind of takes you through an arc of events and decisions.
I cannot wait till Saturday. I hope that he continues to commit at relatively rapid, but not without the opportunity for you to reflect and revise and extend his remarks. And your question, has it aired on Israeli television, which I think would be obvious? I don't know if they have the rights or you're negotiating for that.
No, they did. So friends of mine who are Israeli journalists, Yonit Levy and Amit Segel and Nadav Ayel, a couple of those names you may recognize from my podcast, yes. They did a Hebrew language interview with him. So the Hebrew language interview ran in Israel. But here's what's interesting. The English language episode is now, even though the Hebrew language interview already aired, and the Hebrew language interview was shorter than ours, but it covers a lot of the same content. But the English language episode is getting a lot of attention in Israel for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is one thing Israeli citizens want from their leaders is partly why Benjamin Netanyahu has been so successful politically, is because they want to know that their leaders can go abroad, make their case, explain themselves, explain Israel's story, explain Israel's dilemmas and challenges in English to foreign audiences. And so they'd never seen Gallant doing this, where he sits down and he can hold his own for a long conversation to a U.S. international platform. So it's the fact that he's doing this and the way he's doing it, taking him out of his normal comfort zone, is actually getting attention in and of itself.
Of course it would. It's a fourth dimension. It would be like when Melania in California starts talking Slovakian to one of the victims, and everyone reels backwards because it's fourth dimensional communication. So that is extraordinary. Dan Senor, thank you. I look forward to listening to it on Saturday, having you back soon. And I hope Saturday, whatever happens on Saturday, I hope it's good. I have no idea what good is, but I hope it's good. Dan Senor can be followed on X at Dan Senor, the Call Me Back podcast, available everywhere. Like and follow it. You'll be happy you did. Coming up, Jim Talent is going to join me to talk about the disgusting attacks on Elbridge Colby, who's going to be the Undersecretary for Defense, being made by anonymous leaks on the Hill. I don't really have any idea why. Bridge Colby understands China is the, quote, pacing threat for America. And he's a specialist. He's done this before. He's been the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He's been a defense specialist for 15 years. He served everyone. And Bridge has been a guest on this program. I don't know him well. I know him, say hello to. And I'm in awe of his knowledge and command of facts. And he has points of view about which I may have disagreements, but that does not go to qualifications. It goes to persuasion and disagreement and argument, and it just has got to stop. And Republicans who go after Bridge Colby are going to pay a price. They just will, and they should. And I really hate anonymous. Stand up. You want to attack someone who's been nominated, stand up. Don't be Democrat. Big story today in the Wall Street Journal, and it goes to my sponsor, andrewandtodd.com. As buyers fail to show up, more homes are being pulled from sale. Subheadline, an increase in the number of properties being delisted could be an early sign of a weakening housing market, by Carol Ryan. The first paragraph is, delistings tend to spike in winter when fewer people are actively looking for a home. But the trend last December was unusually strong, representing almost 1 in 10 properties on the market, a 64% increase from the same month in 2023. So in December of 2024, at the start, let's say 1 million people had their house on the market. 100,000 of them took that off. And that's bigger by almost a factor of 100% from the year before. That means an even tighter home market. That's why you need to call andrewandtodd.com, 888-888-1172. Now, Andrew Del Rey has been my friend for more than 20 years. We were in a Bible study together. I've told you that frequently. Todd Avakian, I've known for half as long because I was introduced to him by Andrew, and I persuaded him to come and sponsor the program because I wanted to have, I had a mortgage broker for years, good guy, but he's a broker, not a lender. And now I got a broker. Now I got a lender, not a broker. And that's a big difference. andrewandtodd.com or Sierra Pacific Mortgage. They underwrite the loan. So they take your application, they work with you to make it as best as possible. They give you counseling on how much to buy, how much you should put down. If you're a veteran, they'll tell you about 0% lending. If you're a first-time home buyer, they'll talk you through the FHA process, or they'll just go get the standard rate compared to what's on the market, and they'll tell you, this is our best rate. You can buy it down for this amount of money, and based on our, 50, 60 years of experience combined, this is what we think you ought to do. Maybe it's a 20-year, maybe it's a 15, maybe it's a standard 30, maybe it's the VA. If you're a senior citizen over 62 living in your primary residence and you want to get money out of your house, but you never want to make another mortgage payment, that's called a reverse mortgage. Andrew and Todd do those. 888-888-1172. A lot of you have done that, and more of you are doing that as the budgets get very tight, as Bidenomics kicks in. Still hurting us. The tax cuts have got to get through the House and the Senate before the market takes off and the economy recovers. But housing is a tough time, and they point in here that many, many people in this article have had to move. 2/3 of borrowers are paying a mortgage rate less than 4%. They don't want to move, but some of them have to move. They got to get a bigger house because they've added to the family or they got married. They get transferred by the military or by their employer, or they're making a clean break and a fresh start somewhere. So they got to move. They don't have a choice. If you're one of those people, call Andrew and Todd first, 888-888-1172, because they're the best. Andrew and Todd did my loan. They did Dwayne's loan. They've done thousands of your loan. They're the best. andrewandtodd.com, 888-888-1172. Trump's special envoy, Adam Boehler, was on Fox with Will Cain earlier, cut number 16.
Well, at the end of the day, the president has seen movement, and who knows what would happen if he wasn't there, but it's not enough. We still have 7 Americans that are there, and we're not going to stop until that's the case. And so I hope that Hamas is hearing loud and clear from the president of the United States that they've got to address that issue immediately.
Number
So I want to
17,
be clear, if I might.
Adam Boehler again.
It's not a guarantee until the president says that he's satisfied. He has the reserve to adjust one way or the other. I just know that I've been in meetings with him where he's been heavily concerned about all Americans that are there. He's also been clearly concerned about all Israelis that are there, too, because his message is that there shouldn't be any issue, that we have a terrorist organization that is holding people and they need to release it. They're holding back the Palestinian people. They're holding back peace. Right. But I know for sure there's no discussion until we see those Americans released.
888-888, what am I saying? Joined by Jim Talent, former senator from Missouri. He is the chair of the National Leadership Council for the Reagan Institute. Senator, welcome. I want to talk to you about Bridge Colby, but first I want to read you a quote that I just saw during the break. Pete Hegseth at the NATO meeting today said, "We can talk about values all we want. Values are important, but you can't shoot values. You can't shoot flags, and you can't shoot strong speeches. There's no replacement for hard power. As much as we may not want to like the world we live in some cases, there's nothing like hard power." Good message for the Secretary of Defense to be sending?
Absolutely. And, you know, the readiness and capabilities of America's armed forces are what give life and strength and time for the tools of soft power to work. I think it was George Kennan who said, it's amazing how much more pleasant diplomacy is when you have a little hard power or a little armed force in the background. So it's the right statement for him to make, and I'm glad he's making it in that forum.
Now, Senator, Bridge Colby is a friend of the show. I've met him a few times. Not a good friend. He's not like Robert O'Brien or you or Mike Gallagher, but I think he knows his stuff. I think he is a very, very much China hawk, and that he will be a great Undersecretary of Defense. But there's an article in the Hill today taking shots at him, anonymous sources, allegedly an anonymous Republican senator. What do you make, A, of his qualifications, of B, anonymous sources taking pot shots at one of our guys?
Yeah. Bridge is brilliant, and he's going to be part of a team that is going to offer a lot of different viewpoints to the president. I mean, he's got Marco Rubio, he's got Waltz, he's got Ratliff, now he's got Tulsi Gabbard. He's going to have Bridge Colby. Bridge's book, which I imagine you've read, Strategy of Denial, is a really brilliant discussion of how we can.
I have not.
Oh, it's a great book. How we can. My gosh, I've read a book you haven't read.
Well, someone's got to promote it to me. You just did. Now, he's not much of a promoter of his own books, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, he should have been on the show. I can cross something off my bucket list now. I never thought I'd be able to say that. It's a really good book. I've had discussions with Bridge because one of the points I've made to Bridge is that China's ambitions are global. And so if we want to contest them effectively, we have to contest them in places like Latin America and Africa. I watched him on a panel with Mark Montgomery that Jerry Hendricks invited me to, I don't know, a few months ago. It was a really interesting discussion. He's going to get confirmed. Now, what I will say you is I think his hearing is going to be a very healthy and productive hearing. It's what the Senate ought to be doing is discussing some of these foreign policy issues, airing disagreements, but he's brilliant. He's going to serve the president well. And if there is a real attempt to undermine him anonymously, that's just something that shouldn't happen. People ought to come out and say what they think.
That's what I think. And you can oppose anyone you want, but talk to me about it. If it's Dick Durbin opposing Kash Patel, sure. I pay no attention. But if there's a Republican senator who's got a problem, I want to know what it is and why. Now, Mark Montgomery, the admiral, by coincidence, I had booked him early this morning after reading about the launch of a new Chinese carrier and the fifth-generation fighter, the J-35 that it carries. And we talked about submarines, and we talked for 3 segments about it. It's over at my YouTube channel. He also said, we don't agree on everything, but the guy is really smart. That's a summary, a paraphrase of what Admiral Montgomery said. Do you think there's anyone who's going to argue he's not qualified?
No, I don't know how they possibly can. And again, this is President Trump's style. He doesn't want everybody who works for him, either in foreign or domestic policy, to be telling him the same thing. I mean, I know enough about Donald Trump to know that if he started hearing just one point of view from everybody, he would seek out other views. He also, of course, has a number of contacts outside of the formal government that he's going to talk to. So, but look, Bridge gets an awful lot right. And I don't want to sound like I think he's some tremendously heterodox thinker, which would be okay. I don't think he's that way at all. And I think he's over at defense primarily because China is the pacing threat, as you know, and as you've discussed with Mark Montgomery in a lot of cases. And by the way, that aircraft carrier that you talked to Mark about, that shows what I was saying before. Their ambitions are global, and they're building an expeditionary military. They're going to have the power to conduct a war away from their shores in 10 or 15 years to protect their interests. And they're going to be able to deploy everywhere in the world within a couple of decades. So we obviously need to get moving.
The good news on that front, but that story was sent to me by a retired United States Marine Corps general who said, China doesn't need to dominate every theater. They have to be competitive in every theater. And this is their step to be competitive in the carrier-based war theater. And it's a wake-up call. But the good news is the House Budget Committee has brought over the Freedom Caucus, and it's ambiguous. They say defense and the border is going to get $300 billion in the reconciliation package. And if that's even 50-50, I'm happy. I'd prefer to be 60-40 defense border. But what do you think of that?
I think it's about right. I mean, you can analyze this out the kazoo, and people like Mark have and Jerry Hendricks have, or you can just if you're familiar with the department and you've worked these issues a long time, you know that what we need is about a 3 to 5% real dollar increase every year, sustained out through what they call a fit-up, a 5-year defense plan. And it has to be reliable funding, and a whole lot of it's got to be devoted to the defense industrial base, and in particular, the shipyard industrial base. And now that Jerry Hendricks has gone inside at the National Security Council, we can expect that money to be spent wisely. So it sounds about right to me, Hugh. I mean, again, we can argue on the margin about what the exact number ought to be, but it needs to be good, solid increases over a long period of time.
That's what the Admiral said this first hour. $40 billion increase every year for the rest of the Trump administration into the second administration that follows him would do a lot towards preparing us to make sure that we don't go from Cold War to hot war with China. 30 seconds, Jim, you agree with that? $40 billion a year for the next 8 years?
Yeah, I do. And people, I mean, you'd love to spend more. Reagan had bigger increases than that, but he had a healthy defense industrial base. I mean, there's no use appropriating money you can't spend. I mean,
exactly.
The submarines, for example, I mean, Congress wants to buy submarines, but we can't produce them. So we have to build that capability.
Jim Talent, follow him on X, Jim Talent. Listen to him on Dwayne's World, the podcast that you've got to listen to for a longer conversation with the senator. I do want to play for you the first question that was asked of President Trump in the Oval Office gaggle today by Caitlin Collins of CNN, cut number 16.
Mr. President, you won the White House in part because of high inflation. If your tariffs make prices go up...
Excuse me, we haven't asked you to speak yet, please.
She did get to ask the question, but I want to make sure I play everything because Caitlin was mad at me yesterday because I said she has 2 questions at a press conference and she has 4, so I'm not going to not play everything she says. I am going to direct her and every other member of legacy media who's just been selling you the bogus constitutional crisis. Wall Street Journal today, Harvard Law professor Adrian Vermeulen writes, J.D. Vance's tweet is no crisis. Judge also have an obligation to respect the separation of powers. Usually, they do so. Did Vice President Vance set off a constitutional crisis with a recent tweet? Many journalists and law professors seem to think so. Quote, the judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation that would be illegal, Mr. Vance wrote. The judge tried to command the attorney general on how to use her discretion as a prosecutor. That's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. The professor goes on to write, Mr. Vance's more alarmist critics, that would include Ms. Collins, assume that the executive branch was preparing or threatening to defy court orders. But the more straightforward reading is that he's referring to legal doctrines of justiciability, reviewability, standing, and so-called political question doctrine, which are themselves legal principles that courts apply in determining when they have jurisdiction to review executive action. All these principles are ultimately rooted in the constitutional separation of powers or in statutes embodying and implementing separation of powers issue. To be sure, there's a long tradition of departmentalism in American law, under which presidents have sometimes interpreted the law for themselves and even refused to enforce court orders or threatened to do so, a possibility to which Alexander Hamilton referred to in Federalist number 78. It goes on. I put it on my X tweet. He's right. The legacy media is wrong. Alarmists are wrong. Maybe they ought to read a little bit before they spout off.